Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first ever True Crime Knit Night. I'm very nervous trying to film this because, as far as I know, this is the first knitting podcast of its kind. So the question that may come up for those of you who aren't expecting it is, why true crime? That's because individually, I've always been interested in the macabre and all things crime related, even when I was young. I don't have a definitive reason as to why, but I know that when I do knit, I'm usually watching or listening to something that is true crime related. So because I wanted this content for myself, but I couldn't find it, I've decided to be that person that brings it to you guys. And according to my Instagram stories, when I polled you guys, 85% of my followers do like true crime as well. So this is for you guys. For those of you who don't like true crime, you're welcome to try and stay, but I will warn you that this may not be the podcast for you. I'm not going to go into gruesome detail about what was done to the victim, at least more than what crosses, I think, a decency line. But it still deals with heavy subjects. Murder, obviously, but this case deals with incest and sexual violence against minors. So if those are subjects that you're particularly sensitive to, I would advise you to come back next week when I will have a normal knitting podcast, where I just talk about my knitting and my yarn and whatever. So come back next week. It was nice to see you, but this probably isn't for you. For those of you who are staying, though, welcome. Just so everybody's aware, I'm going to keep an informal tone, and that's just because it's true to the way that I speak. And that's to preserve the authenticity of a knit night. I'm going to talk to you like I would at a normal knit night. And this means that there may be some foul language. But that's only related to police incompetence, which this case is full of. And when I'm talking about the murderer, but I think they deserve it. So, that's just my heads up. So if you're still here after that, welcome. I'd like you to pull up your knitting. I'm working on my Gabrielle cardigan. I have 20 centimeters of straight stockinette on a sleeve to go. So I can focus on both you and the story and this. Okay, so pull up your knitting, pour yourself a drink if you're so inclined, and let me tell you a story. We begin on the morning of September 10th in 1999. Jessica Dishon is a senior in high school, 17 years old in rural Kentucky, and she woke up at 6:45 in the morning. Apparently that was her normal routine. I kind of forget that students are expected to wake up so ungodly early. I like to imagine Jessica as a girl who owned lots of scrunchies and was a Backstreet Boys fan and didn't like NSYNC. Just to humanize her as a teenager growing up in the 90s. The house was empty while Jessica got ready for school. Her mother had left the house even earlier than 6:45. Her father was already at work, and her younger brother, Michael, had already taken the bus to school. Now, Jessica was supposed to drive herself to school like she did every day. She took a red Pontiac that she bought herself by saving up her wages working at the Hardee's. And for those of you who don't know, a Hardee's is a fast food restaurant that's usually found at truck stops. When Jessica's mother, Edna, returned that afternoon, she saw Jessica's car was still in the driveway. And she thought, okay, that's weird. Jessica's supposed to be at school. Edna went in to look for her in the house, thinking that maybe Jessica was sick or really, really bad at playing hooky. Jessica wasn't home, however, so Edna went back outside and looked at the car. And that's when she noticed that Jessica's things were still inside. There was a purse, a backpack, one of her shoes left on the driver's seat, and her phone with the number 9 on the display screen. So Jessica had attempted to dial a number beginning with 9. So Edna obviously realizes something is wrong. So she calls her husband, Mike, and the two spend hours calling the school, work, friends, family, neighbors, just frantically trying to locate Jessica. With no sign of her at all, they finally call the sheriff's office. The fresh-faced deputy who responds is named Deputy Greenwell, And when he came onto the scene, he suspected foul play, which was pretty obvious given the circumstances. Like, what teenager would possibly leave home without a car, without a phone, without a wallet, but also with one shoe? It made no sense. But when Deputy Greenwell called the senior detective for backup, he called twice, by the way, the detective dismissed Jessica's disappearance as a runaway and said, "I'm not going out there." So he refused to even come to the scene. So Jessica's car sat in the driveway during the entire weekend while friends and family pored over the contents of the vehicle, and a journalist even went in the car and filmed a segment for the news. So if there was anything of evidentiary value in the car, it was already contaminated before the investigation even began. Now, frustrated that the police were having trouble finding Jessica and had actively dismissed them for 3 days while Jessica was missing, Mike and Edna decided to call in the FBI and request assistance. The Dishon family put up $18,000 as a reward for information about Jessica's whereabouts. And for context, that is more than $28,000 in today's economy. So that's a pretty chunk of change. Sadly, 17 days after Jessica went missing, police got a call from a bus driver. She was on her normal route, which happened to be 7 miles away from the Dishon home, when she spotted a body in a ravine about 90 feet from the road. Now, the distance here is important because there was evidence to suggest that this body was moved around 15 feet closer to the road than the original site the body was left. And police suspected that this may have been done just hours before this body was found. Obviously, this suggests someone wanted the person found enough to risk returning to the body. So police identified the body as Jessica Dishon's with her class ring, a necklace, and a tattoo. Later in autopsy, they confirmed it with dental records as well. So Jessica was found sitting up against a tree. Her pants were pulled halfway down, and a rope with traces of red, silver, and gray paint was found wrapped around her leg. Autopsy reports show that she'd likely been kept alive for 2 or 3 days and tortured, with the cause of death listed as strangulation. Given the way her clothes were found, police obviously believed that she was sexually assaulted, but forensics couldn't find definitive proof of that, such as body fluids. Finding Jessica's body kicked the investigation into frenzy mode, and police zeroed in on one of the Dishon's neighbors as a suspect. David "Bucky" Brooks and his family lived next to the Dishons. Bucky, as he was known to his family and friends, was 40 years old, worked as a farmhand, and had a low IQ, bordering on mental handicap. When questioned by police, he couldn't seem to keep his story straight and seemed evasive, or maybe just really freaked out to be interviewed by police about a dead girl. To be fair, there was some circumstantial evidence. There were several witnesses who said they saw Bucky's van on the road that Jessica's body was eventually found on, but this was days before the discovery of the body, so take that quote-unquote evidence with a big block of salt, like the kind you give cows. Anyway, the police obtained a warrant for the Brooks property, and they took a scent dog with them. The scent dog led them to a building on the property where there were a pair of work gloves found under a cushion, and these gloves apparently had a weird smell on them. The police searched the work van that Bucky drove, and there was rope that resembled the rope found on Jessica's body. So to me, that evidence seems hella weak, but despite that, police and prosecutors kept narrowing in on Bucky as the culprit, and eventually they arrested and tried him for Jessica's murder. That trial ended in a mistrial in 2002 when the detective, yes, the same one who refused to go to the Dishon family home when Jessica first went missing, he actually went on the stand and said that Bucky was a suspect because Bucky failed a polygraph test. Now, fun fact, Bucky actually took 6 polygraph tests. He failed 2 and 4, 2 were inconclusive. 2 were inconclusive, and 4 showed dishonesty. But the more fun fact to know is that lie detector tests are not admissible evidence. Police still use them because they say it's a good investigative tool that helps them narrow down suspects, but they're not admissible in a court of law. So that detective, like, what a freaking idiot. Anyway, after the mistrial was declared, the case went almost untouched for 10 years until 2012. So the Dishons had to live that entire time without knowing who took Jessica. Now, 2012 is when Detective Lynn Hunt joins Bullitt County Sheriff's Office. She'd actually retired from Louisville PD only 3 months before, and in both places she specialized in sexual assault and cold cases. Side note, if I was murdered and people couldn't figure out who did it, I would want Detective Hunt on the case for sure. So Detective Hunt, if you're listening, just like keep an eye out for me, I guess. I hope I'm not murdered. Anyway, so Detective Hunt joined the sheriff's office to go over their cold cases. And remember Little Deputy Greenwell, the first responding officer who came to Jessica's home the day that she went missing? Well, he's sheriff now, and he really wants this case solved. But Detective Hunt planned on saving Jessica's case for last because of just how much evidence there was and the complicated case history. But plans really changed for her when a former Louisville colleague reached out and said an inmate called in a tip that he knew who killed Jessica Dishon, her uncle, Stanley Dishon, because Jessica told Stanley that she wouldn't keep quiet anymore about the fact that he had been molesting her while he lived in her family's home. Yeah. So how did the inmate know this? Because Stanley knew Stanley. Stanley was actually in prison, in the same prison, for sexually assaulting minors. He was convicted the same year they tried Bucky for Jessica's murder in 2002. And no one thought to ask whether Stanley could have possibly been involved. But anyway, the inmate reported that Stanley said that Stanley hit Jessica as she was leaving for school and took her to an abandoned barn. He said that Stanley kept her for 3 days and tortured her and eventually strangled her. He then moved her body because he felt so bad and wanted her to be found. But can you imagine, like, this asshole just looking at his own brother's face as his brother is just completely distraught over his missing daughter, and like having her tied up in a barn somewhere for days, and then like moving her body because like, oh, I feel bad. I don't understand how anybody can do that, but I guess the fact that I don't understand is a good thing. So through interviews, Detective Hunt pieced together a timeline of where Stanley was living from the time he was a teenager to his arrest in 2002. And she found that Stanley had jumped around a lot from siblings' homes. So like he visited his brother and then his sister and then another brother. And each time he bounced, like every house he went to, he was abusing many of their children. So remember when I said that Stanley allegedly abused Jessica while he lived in her family's home? So according to the timeline that Detective Hunt put together, Stanley lived in the home with Jessica from 1989 to 1996. That is 7 years. Can you imagine like little Jessica like growing up in that household, being groomed, and then living with that same person for years? Makes me mad. Now, police considered the tip credible because this inmate knew things about the crime scene and Jessica's body that he just should not have known. Another inmate actually came forward pointing the finger at Stanley as well. So you'd think, okay, yeah, this is the wheeling and dealing that happens in prison. Yeah. Shave time for some hot goss. But that's not how the new prosecutor, Michael Ferguson, wanted to play. He told the inmates that they wouldn't get a deal of any kind, even if they testified. But don't worry, there was more evidence to be found. In something like a freaking movie, Detective Hunt and Jessica's little brother Michael went to the area where Jessica's body was found. They went into the woods nearby, and they kept walking until they found an abandoned barn. When they went inside, they found a bed sheet that was buried in the dirt, like in a shallow little ditch. And that bed sheet came to be an exact match to Jessica's room, which Edna and Mike, even though they divorced and separated, agreed to leave exactly as it was when Jessica was alive. So finally, Stanley Dishon was being interviewed by police. He was nervous and shaking, but he refused to confess. But then came the other charges. Because Detective Hunt turned over every rock and tracked down every minor girl who had the misfortune of living with this asshole. And yes, they were willing to testify that he had sexually abused them. So Jessica's dad, Mike, Stanley's brother, didn't want to believe that his brother could do it. But after all of Stanley's victims came forward, Mike finally had to accept what really had happened. And God, I can't believe how devastating that was to like know that the person, like your family member who you invited into your home, like hurt your family. Anyway, it's a lot. So facing the cold reality of dying in prison with all of these charges, Stanley Dishon instead chose to take something called an Alford plea for manslaughter and other sex crimes. And for those of you who haven't heard of this or maybe just forgot, an Alford plea is essentially the defendant saying, I'm not saying I did it, but I do accept that the prosecution definitely has enough evidence to convict me. So let's get going with this. It's not a guilty plea exactly. It's tough to explain. It's weird. That's why it has its own special name. But anyway, at the sentencing hearing, Mike, Jessica's dad, confronted his brother Stanley, and Stanley just stared right back at him like a freaking shark. And Mike was just crying, like saying he let him into his home to get back on his feet, and that's how Stanley repaid them. And it was just tragic. So in March 2015, Stanley Dishon was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike said that Stanley still contacts the family, like constantly, saying he didn't do it. And Mike knows he's lying because why else would he take the plea deal if he was telling the truth? Now, Mike is the reason I actually chose this case as my first true crime knit night case. Years ago, I saw an interview with Mike saying that Stanley didn't just take Jessica. He took Mike's son Michael's childhood. He ruined Mike's marriage with Edna. And Mike then said he's taking great pains to live a long, healthy life so that when Stanley gets out, Mike can kill Stanley himself. Which, on a human level, I understand. But also, like, wow, to say that, like, on national TV. Anyway. So, anyway, what Mike said really stuck with me. Both his desire for revenge and just, like, the audacity. But also, what he said about losing Jessica led to so much more loss in the family. And it's really important for me as someone who sees true crime most of the time as entertainment, that these are people's lives that are being affected, you know, like they live complex lives, and the trauma of losing a family member to violence is not just the family member's life, but all the harm that comes after it. Anyway, I hope that wasn't too big of a bummer. But I hope if there is an afterlife, Jessica is able to exist in comfort and peace, because her life was so full of trauma and cut so tragically short. Of course, all the best wishes to the entire Dishon family, except Stanley. He can die. Yeah. But that's the sad story of Jessica Dishon. Thank you, everyone who tuned in for my very first True Crime Knit Night. I think I'll only do these like once a month, because actually researching the cases takes a long time. And I always need to make sure I have something stockinette to work on so I can occasionally look at you guys. I hope y'all enjoyed it, and I hope you like and subscribe if you did. Again, stay tuned for more episodes, but I will let you guys know when there's an upcoming one. Thanks for coming and sitting with me. And I'm going really slow because I have to read my notes while I'm talking out loud, so it changes how I knit. is this how normal people knit? Like the slow, steady pace? Anyway, thanks for coming, you guys. And I guess I'll see you next time. Bye.